Thank you. Sorry for the delay. I'm going to take 1 2-minute comment before the panel. I know, Gerwin, you have to leave soon, but I just have one person who has a plane. And so since there's only one, I'm going to go ahead. So 2 minutes, since you're jumping the queue. Darcy Luce from Friends of the Estuary, Friends of San Francisco Estuary. Only asked for 2 minutes, which is good.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate. I really do have a plane to catch in Oakland. My name is Darcy Luce. I'm here to speak on behalf of Friends of the San Francisco Estuary. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. We really would like to express our appreciation for your efforts to protect all beneficial uses, including agriculture, urban needs, and public trust resources during this record-breaking drought. And the pain of this drought has been felt by all sectors. But we're now facing the imminent loss or collapse of multiple fish species, including the endangered wintered run Chinook salmon and commercially and recreationally important fall run Chinook salmon and white sturgeon populations. We understand that this is a highly complex situation with many moving parts, but we really need to ask, with the pending extinction of the Delta smelt, possibly due in part to relaxation of Delta outflow standards this past spring, how many other endangered species might get sacrificed in the name of balancing beneficial uses? This past winter, the State Board cut environmental safeguards that regulate freshwater flow into the estuary, and there is no debate that this harmed our native species. The continued relaxation of these safeguards compromises the ability of our fish and wildlife to withstand the effects of the drought. The only justification for this decision is the vigorous preservation of cold water storage for the protection of endangered species later this year. However, the same strategy was used last year, as mentioned, with devastating effects on multiple salmon populations. So far, it appears that you're on track to repeat the mistakes of last year by relying on temperature projections that have a record of underestimating the amount of water needed to maintain protections for salmon. You're also allowing more water to be delivered to senior water rights holders early in the year, rather than holding that water for later in the year when it will be needed by salmon the most. We're deeply concerned that these actions will culminate in a repeat of last year's tragic consequences. We ask, this is not an acceptable balancing of beneficial uses when human health and safety standards have already been met. You must act now to protect our faltering fish and wildlife species, our economic well-being, and the ecosystems of the San Francisco Bay Delta Estuary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hello, fish people.
Morning, Chair Marcus.
Fish folks, right, fish folks. Yeah, appreciate the
Morning.
wildlife agencies. Mr. Yip.
I am Garwin Yip with NOAA Fisheries, and I'm speaking on behalf of the fish agencies and focusing on the Sacramento Temperature Management Plan. I have a PowerPoint here. Okay, so this should be a familiar graphic for everybody. This was last year's May temperature forecast and projection for Clear Creek. One thing I wanted to highlight on this graph is the light blue that identifies Keswick temperatures and the heavy green line for Clear Creek temperature compliance point. Throughout most of the season, they were pretty much overlapped on top of each other. When we look at the real temperatures at the Keswick and Clear Creek temperature compliance point, there's a difference about 100 or 1.3 degree difference. So the question that we have is, looking back, is Clear Creek accurate and Keswick is really 1.3 lower, or is Keswick accurate in this graph and Clear Creek is really 1.3 higher? Now we look at, when we talk about 56 degrees, the compliance is 56 degrees on a daily average, and that's the blue line. But when we look at the hourly, we see that it goes up approximately 2 degrees higher than the daily average throughout the season. So 56 on a daily average goes upwards of 58 during the season, and as we know, in quotes, temperatures fell apart near the end of the season, starting in August, and it goes up to 62. So here's what Ron projected, and this is the April 90% exceedance for this year. One of the differences between this year and last year, and as a result of the hindcasting report that Reclamation submitted to the Water Board, is the side gate operation that seemed to result in temperatures that exceeded what we anticipated. So for this year, one of the things that we worked out with Reclamation is the ability to delay the use of the first side gate operation to August 13th. And then what we anticipate as the end of the winter run emergence time frame, approximately mid-October, to access the side gates only operation, with the suspicion that if the same thing happens this year as last year with full side gate operations, it'll happen after most, if not all, of the winter run have emerged. So in comparison between this year and last year, so we talk about end of September storage, we talk about the current storage, how much cold water, and the water quality, the temperature of the cold water pool right now. On last Thursday, we received, Reclamation received from the Executive Director a provisional approval of the temperature management plan. When you look at the sub-bullets identifying the monthly averages per month, I have an asterisk for July because we identified the 9,000 as a maximum and not a monthly average for July. One of the things we tried to do in working with Reclamation on the operations plan is to try to stabilize the flows July, August, September for winter and spawning so that they don't spawn in water flows higher than 9,000 with additional risk to dewatering their redds. I have double asterisks in October, November because looking at the provisional acceptance or approval of the plan from Tom Howard, it goes up to September. And I highlighted October and November here because one of the intentions that we had in working with Reclamation and developing the temperature management plan and Keswick flow release schedule is to try to maintain around 6,000 or 6,500, at least in the beginning of October, to maintain the flows until the winter run eggs and fry have emerged from the redds. And then from there, the latter half of October to go down to the 4,000, and to maintain 4,000 starting in November for stabilizing flows for fall run redds. So improved Shasta cold water pool. So here's some of the changes or efforts that we put into in comparison with last year. Part of our reasonable prudent alternative is in this kind of water year where end of September carryover storage from last year, 2014, is less than 1.9 million acre feet, we put a limit on Wilkins Slough flows at 4,000. So this year we established a limit of no more than 3,800 for purposes of saving some of that cold water. Relaxation of D1641 requirements in the Delta. Ron talked about delaying the Sac Sediment contracted depletions to the extent that they could from April to May, and now we're at 7,500. And part of that delay helps in not increasing releases. As Ron was talking about, the limit of 9,000 in July. I don't know how far we go back, but we've seen numbers upwards of 12, 14,000 in the summer, so that was a big deal for the Sac Sediment contractors and also for us. Ron mentioned the 58 degrees. One of the things that we as the fish agencies through the Sac Settlement or Sac River Temperature Task Group mentioned last year is why not save some of that water, provide the 58 degree as the compliance temperature at the location of Clear Creek until we see evidence of spawning, and then lower it to 56 throughout the season. One of the things we don't...
Can I ask an ignorant question about that?
Sure.
So if you're a fish and it's warmer lower down, does that affect where you lay your eggs? I know other things pay attention. So is it a way to attract them further up to lay their eggs?
One of the concepts before, and I'm not sure about now because we haven't talked about it that much, is to provide warmer releases earlier in the season to attract them farther up, and then start expanding that cold water to provide more habitat. Warm water bypass, Ron mentioned that. He mentioned about 120,000 acre feet of warm water bypass in the tune of $1.5 million. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but I have a slide that depicts that. And it shows about 80,000 acre feet of cold water savings with that effort. temperature modeling. So we have a hindcast report, and some of the recommendations or observations of that hindcast report Ron mentioned, and you have the graphic showing the side gates and the use of them. And then we required, as part of our response to the February forecast and initial allocations to reclamation, a temperature modeling group to be convened, an interagency team of experts to take a look at the temperature model and see exactly what the problems were. I mentioned one of them was the 1.3 degree difference in actual temperatures compared to the modeling, and how we can tweak that model, or what kind of disclaimers we could use. You know, we use disclaimers all the time, but how true are they when we make assumptions as to how accurate the graphics are compared to real-time management. And then finally, last year, we implemented the winter run contingency plan, which we also adopted for this year, and that's really to provide an insurance policy or a Band-Aid to not put all the eggs in the natural basket, just in case, like last year, temperatures were so high that we had a high mortality of eggs in halibut and fry, is to put increased broodstock at Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery. There's also an ongoing effort, and it's being implemented now, starting in April, is ACID, Anderson Calusa Irrigation District dam location, is to put a collection facility there to minimize handling and potential mortality associated with the handling on winter run and other fish species. So as they make it up past ACID, personnel, and I'm not sure if it's Fish and Wildlife Service or CDFW, they can look at the fish and determine whether any given fish can be taken as broodstock rather than wait until they get up to Keswick Trap, which has associated issues with handling and capture of those fish. To date, and I think I have a slide that identifies this, but to date, the ACID trap has been functional. We're not monitoring 24 hours a day. I think it's maybe 3 hours a night during what we think is migration timing for winter run, and we haven't seen any winter run there. So here's what the water bypass looks like. So you see the sharp peaks going down, let's see, through April 17th, and from there the warm water bypass started. The red line is the temperatures, water temperature, and the bypass is the blue line. So as water is bypassed using the warm water bypass outlet, the water temperature increases and saves the cold water pool that way. So ACID, currently no fish trap, no fish is adult winter run. Carcass survey started April 28th. We found one carcass on May 10th, so spawning has started. And area red surveys, no reds observed. And so one of the, well, I guess two disclaimers, one for carcass surveys and one for reds, is that it's really a subsample, because the area red surveys and also the carcass surveys, they can't see every fish. So seeing a carcass is an indication that there's more than, well, the carcass is a spawned out carcass, I should clarify, represents more than just one red being developed. And no reds observed doesn't mean that there hasn't been any spawning, it's just not observed during the area red surveys. So on the top right, I have two Band-Aids. One represents last year and the other represents this year. So I talked about winter run contingency plan. One of the contingencies is, in a typical year, we've established a limit for Livingston Stone broodstock collection at no more than 120 adult winter run, preferably split half and half, 60 males and 60 females. Last year, we, in quotes, saw the writing on the wall as far as temperatures, and we allowed collection of up to 400 adults. 388 were captured. And this year, we allowed the same thing up to 400. So you see the numbers there, the total males and females, and then you add the May 19th update, and we're looking at just over 200 adults collected so far. The Band-Aids being that it's not a solution. You know, we have Coleman National Fish Hatchery, 30 million fall run. You have other hatcheries. We truck them down to the Delta as other Band-Aids. For winter run, we don't want to go down that path. We don't want to truck them, and we don't want to start a production hatchery. These are for conservation in cases like this in a drought year where we don't anticipate that high survival in the natural environment. So next steps, it's not over just because I presented, and there's a management plan. Going down to the fourth bullet, here's what Tom Howard said in the order on May 14th. If there's any indications that things aren't what we anticipated, then let them know immediately, and it's the same for the fish agencies and also for NIMS. But we work closely with Reclamation on a weekly, if not daily basis on the Sac River Temperature Management team. There's also a subgroup of that team to talk about real-time management decisions or recommendations to the managers as necessary. There's also the RT-DOT, the real-time drought operations management team, and we also just call each other and convene meetings as necessary. Right now, as of Monday, May 18th, we received a letter and a revised project description from Reclamation that includes the Sac River Temperature operations plan for ESA compliance and concurrence. So we're working through that right now. So as Tom Howard's disclaimer there, for us, it's not a done deal just because Reclamation proposed it. So we need to work through the ESA part of it. And we are going to continue the aerial red surveys, we being CDFW, and monitor the timing and location of winter run reds. Any questions?
Chairman Marcus, board members, Carl Wilcox, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm not going to comment much on the salmon side of things. Garwin covered it. The department is integrally involved in the temperature task group, working with NIMS and the Bureau and the Fish and Wildlife Service in making real-time management decisions. We, along with NIMS, are very concerned, as is everybody else, with the accuracy of the temperature modeling and the ability to achieve the temperature objectives at Clear Creek, and we'll be watching that very closely and participating in the decision-making process as far as how that's managed going forward. I think it is important to recognize the settlement contractor's efforts to provide delivery schedules that haven't been available in the past to help us better understand how we can manage the system, as well as the transfers, which will retain water later into the year in storage that can be help with the temperature management issue. So with that, the department will be doing added monitoring as it did last year, particularly as it relates to red dewatering and that kind of thing, based on release changes in flows associated with Keswick releases. That was a substantial issue last year. We had drought funding. We will have drought funding again this year to be able to staff those activities to keep track of things. We'll also be monitoring temperatures in the reds in relationship to the temperature monitoring and looking at the issues of, what micro water temperature effects are, not just the daily averages and that kind of thing. Went the wrong way. So with regard to smelt distribution and status, did it get lost here? There, okay. So smelt monitoring in the Delta during the spring, there's the fall midwater trawl, which isn't addressed here, but is completed in the fall. I think as everybody's aware, we saw record low abundance indices for both the smelt species as well as other pelagic fish that are assessed, including striped bass, that are assessed as part of the fall midwater trawl. And we this year started the spring Kodiak trawl, which targets adult Delta smelt distribution in the Delta. We initiated a December sampling to get a sense early in the year of delta smelt distribution, particularly as it related to potential risk associated with water project operations, given the early rain events and the turbidity issues. So that was in addition to the normal sampling that's conducted January through May. This year, through the 5 surveys, a total of 104 adult delta smelt were captured. That is about 37% of the previous low. So the spring Kodiak trawl indices just was released by our Bay Delta office today, and we see the lowest delta smelt spring Kodiak trawl indices that we've recorded in the 11 years of the survey and the indices.
Is that what you would have expected based on the fall results?
Yes. The low numbers are lower than the previous lows, which were in 2006 and 2010, or 2011, which were approximately 18. I think there's a, kind of an upside is that they can recover from those levels, as we saw in 2012 and in the fall of and in 2011. So, with good water conditions, they have the ability to bounce back. But given the length of the drought and the fact that we have had really low levels the last 4 years and are looking at another poor year, there's substantial concern unless we see better outflow in the next water year. The 20 millimeter survey is currently underway, and that looks at juvenile smelt and longfin and delta smelt distribution and relative abundance. And gives us an idea of how well the reproduction has been for that year, as well as where it's found. And we're, again, seeing low numbers as part of that, and have seen pretty significantly low numbers of delta smelt, or not delta smelt, but longfin smelt as well. Fewer and more constrained distribution than we would normally expect. We have the ongoing Bay study that looks at fishes within the delta down into San Francisco Bay. And it's primarily an indicator, particularly of adult distributions, as well as particularly for longfin smelt, where they are in relative numbers once they leave the delta and enter the bay and the near coastal waters as they continue to rear and grow into adults. And then the summer townet, which is targeted at juvenile delta smelt abundance and distribution, will be occurring June through August, and that will give us an idea of how fish are surviving from the 20 millimeter, those that survive, those that were generated through the spawning season, how they survive through the coming year. And we're expecting that those are going to be difficult situations for those fish, given the reduced outflows and the low outflows that we'll see relative to what's required and what's proposed. This is just to give you an idea of what smelt distribution looks like based on the 20 millimeter survey. This year, this is through Survey 4, which was late April. Survey 5's in the field isn't available yet, but you can see that delta smelt are restricted to a few locations. particularly in the North Delta and towards the confluence in the main stem Sacramento. And longfin are a little farther down in the system, primarily around the confluence. And I included a slide from 2013, which, even though it was a dry year, conditions were operating under the Water Quality Control Plan outflow requirements. And you can see the differences in the distribution and the available habitat for these fish. So basically, the conditions that we've seen the last 2 years really constrain and confine habitat to the upstream areas and reduce available habitat suitability. The last slide I've got here is just Spring Kodiak Trawl 5, just showing distribution. And the fact that, there was an increase. We saw one fish in number 1. We got a few more this time. They're out there. We know that they've spawned, and now we'll be looking at how the results of that spawning fare through the season and lead us into the fall. And I think that's it for me, and I'll turn it over to Larry, unless there are questions.
We'll probably be back to you, but let's move on.
Well, good morning. My name is Larry Rabin, and I'm the acting field supervisor of the Bay Delta Fish and Wildlife Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As you know, drought conditions continue to be profound, and those conditions are not only affecting water deliveries, but have substantial impacts on threatened and endangered species and the ecosystems upon which they rely, as well as on state and federal wildlife refuges. The results of the trawling efforts that Carl just showed suggest that drought has had a significant impact on the Delta smelt population. As Carl mentioned, the fall midwater trawl survey index was 9, a new historic low for the species, and half of the 2013 survey index value. Spring Kodiak trawl numbers were again very low and continue to give us reason to be concerned about the impacts of the drought on the population. For migratory birds dependent on wetlands, including those on refuges, forage resources are expected to become scarce early in the winter. Birds will be crowding into fewer wetlands. There's increased potential for crop depredation. Disease outbreaks are expected from overcrowding and low forage availability, and birds are likely to return to their breeding grounds in impaired condition. And in light of this, federal and state agencies continue coordinating to implement a number of actions in a manner that will provide necessary protections for our trust species while providing flexibility in water operations wherever possible. These actions have included development of temporary urgency change petitions and implementations of orders, transmission of recommendations to water operators during requests for emergency Section 7 consultation, and completion of a programmatic biological opinion that addresses water transfers and associated giant garter snake concerns. And so at this time, I wanted to provide updates on each of those activities. With respect to previous temporary urgency change petitions and fish agency responses, on March 24th, as you know, the service received a request from Reclamation seeking concurrence on Reclamation's determination that the March 24th Tuck petition would result in no additional adverse effects on Delta smelt beyond those analyzed in the 2008 biological opinion on the CVP and SWP. And on March 27th, the service accepted Reclamation's determination. At the time, we noted that DSM-2 analyses in Reclamation's biological review were limited to the April to May timeframe, and consequently, we requested that additional DSM-2 simulations be run through the end of June to allow us to assess juvenile entrainment effects and other potential changes to effects on Delta smelt and their critical habitat through September. Those simulations are currently being reviewed. With respect to the emergency drought barrier at West False River, On April 30th, the Army Corps of Engineers requested emergency consultation on installation of the emergency drought barrier to address Delta water quality concerns in the face of the ongoing drought. And on May 2nd, Reclamation similarly requested emergency consultation to address the effects of operating the CVP and the SWP with the drought barrier in place. The Endangered Species Act and its implementing regulations recognize the necessity to respond immediately to emergencies and provide special procedures that allow action agencies the latitude necessary to complete their emergency response in order to secure human life and property without delay, while still providing those agencies with biological recommendations that normal compliance under the Endangered Species Act would have afforded. In these situations, compliance with the Endangered Species Act must be a lower priority until the response to the emergency situation is complete. It's the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service's policy to assist with Endangered Species Act compliance issues during an emergency response, but to never delay the necessary response to secure human life and property. And so on May 1st and on May 4th, and consistent with our guidelines, the services provided the Corps and Reclamation with our recommendations to minimize the effects of the emergency response on listed species. The services have made both Reclamation and the Corps aware that after they have determined that the emergency is under control, they should initiate formal consultation with us on the emergency drought barrier at West False River. And so now I wanted to transition to giant garter snake and the recently signed programmatic biological opinion. Fish and Wildlife Service programmatic biological opinion. Because giant garter snake rely on summer aquatic habitat and because they forage in rice fields and adjoining canals, the lack of water has reduced habitat available for the species. Fallowing of rice fields has the potential to further reduce habitat. And it was with that in mind that the Fish and Wildlife Service recently issued a programmatic biological opinion to the Bureau of Reclamation on a 10-year water transfer program. This program allows for the transfer of up to 565,000 acre-feet of water and may lead to the fallowing of just over 60,000 acres of rice lands. While the fallowing of rice lands will lead to further reduction in habitat for giant garter snake, the service has determined that Reclamation's programmatic water transfer program will not jeopardize the species. To reduce effects to the species from the transfer program, the program includes a strategy that maintains water in major irrigation and drainage in canals. To ensure that any unanticipated effects to the species are addressed and remedied during program implementation, the effectiveness of providing this water for snakes will be evaluated annually with changes made if necessary through adaptive management. The program also includes monitoring during the summer to assess whether or not there are any other unanticipated effects during implementation of the transfers. There's no doubt that these are challenging times for both Californians and our native fish and wildlife species. And we're committed to continuing to work with our state and federal partners, stakeholders, and the public to implement actions that provide flexibilities in water supplies while conserving our trust species. Thank you.
I'd just like to ask you all the same question I asked the Bureau and the Department on monitoring. So if you could talk a little bit more about monitoring and any improvements that you're seeing this year. I know you already had, some of the slides on smelt in particular. And also wondering if that action that was taken on turbidity, the turbidity bridge or whatever it's called, is that something that was just a one-time thing, or is it something that could be replicated?
Carl Wilcox with Department of Fish and Wildlife. On the turbidity bridge issue, that was something that was worked closely between the water operators and the fisheries agencies through the, well, I would call it an enhanced RTDOT, in that the actual directors met sometimes on a daily basis, using particularly the real-time turbidity monitoring that DWR was doing in the channels every day with a field crew. And operational decisions were made based on that information with the operators. And these meetings happen over weekends, and so I think at the end of the day that was a very effective effort to minimize potential entrainment of delta smelt, since that's closely tied with turbidity at the pumps, and allowing, keeping the turbidity bridge from being created. So that's one thing. There was supplemental Kodiak trawling done in the South Delta as well to help inform fish distribution. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted their early warning sampling at Prisoners Point and Jersey Point to give us an idea of when fish might be moving upstream. That was critical information as far as the turbidity monitoring and the decision making that was done relative to operations during those periods when there was outflow in the system and pumping was at more normal levels. There's extensive monitoring that's being continued from last year, particularly in the upper Sacramento River, looking, as I touched on, reds, red temperatures, water temperatures. We've talked with the settlement contractors about adding some more stations, temperature stations downstream. So there's a high level of monitoring that was developed last year that has continued this year and will continue on, as well as monitoring associated with the drought barrier that is going into place to look at the effects of the drought barrier, not just on water quality, but on species and or ecological conditions in that area.
Can you all, I know you've addressed this in your talk, but I'd like something sort of not necessarily more concise, but maybe a little more clear in terms of how you all feel about the proposed temperature operation at Shasta. I mean, you showed the graphs, but just how do you feel about what the proposal is at the moment or the process?
Yeah, I just thought about it.
I mean,
for
we
10
have to figure
seconds.
out how we feel about it, so I want to know what you feel about it.
I think one of the things we don't know, and unfortunately 2020 hindsight is perfect, so we don't know how many winter run are going to come up. As Ron Milligan mentioned earlier, in quotes, wasting cold water now to provide habitat where winter run are not doesn't help us out later on in the fall. I think in a general sense, and this is very general in consideration of everything out there, all the stressors from upstream at Keswick and even upstream to Shasta, all the way down into the Delta, winter run have obviously taken a hit, all life stages. And given that situation and where we started with taking a look at the February forecast and the SAC temperature modeling to where we landed last week, even April 24th with recommendation submittal, and then last week executive director approval, and also what we know, I think we landed in a pretty decent, it's a less bad situation. It could have been considerably worse, and a lot of it I think had to do with coordinating with the SAC settlement contractors in convincing, encouraging, getting them to partner with us on how to better use the same water that we have. Things could be better, but like I said, we also had that contingency with moving fish to Livingston Stone. So I wouldn't say we're happy, but it's a less bad situation than we could have been in.
I'd agree with Garwin. I think we remain concerned, and it's all going to be in how we're able to manage the system as we progress through the summer. The groundwork that's been laid is better than last year as far as our ability to look back at and see what happened last year and how we can try to account for those issues. But I expect that it's going to get close at the end of the year, and it's not a great situation, but I think we're in a position to make the best we can of it this year.
Thank you.
So for Delta Smelt, I think temperature management upstream is less of an issue. And so for Delta Smelt, temperature management upstream is less of an issue. And so as a result, for us, I think the concerns are more with flow being available in the Delta. And the last panel, Department of Water Resources mentioned that the temporary urgency change petition that's likely to be submitted later this week is consistent with the temporary urgency change petition that was submitted in late March. And that TUC petition is one in which Fish and Wildlife Service again accepted Reclamation's determination that the range of effects would be consistent with those considered in the 2008 biological opinion.
Something to think about. Appreciate that. That was helpful. Steve, sorry.
Real quickly, so just want to acknowledge this challenge, and if you go back to our staff's presentation and comparing the water budget and the different slices of the pie, and how the regulatory slice, which partially is the purpose of which is to meet X2 and other requirements to protect the smelt species, that has shrunk through the TUCP process. And anecdote or empirically, you see this manifestation of narrowed and smaller populations of the smelt species that that are manifest. And in looking at just two questions, is it your feeling that we've had to make these trade-offs within environmental endpoints to get through the drought, and so to keep salmon and cold water, we're putting smelt at greater risk? And then are there things we can do in those areas where the smelt still are getting through this year to manage that situation, to improve their outlook, other than just more water, since we don't have that because we're managing for temperature? So those two questions.
I think, it is the basic trade-off between cold water pool for salmon. The water savings that we see are water savings that reduce outflow, particularly in the winter and spring, which are critical. There will be some reduction with the July change from 4,000 to 3,000 that are going to affect in Delta habitat for Delta smelt in particular, as well as other fishes. We've already seen some indications of algal blooms or phytoplankton blooms in the Delta that have complicated survey work in that they clog the nets. So, things are looking more like summer than spring in the Delta right now. So, I think there aren't a whole lot of things we can do to make up for that lack of flow, because that is really the driver. And I think we've seen that from past years, 2012 in particular, where we had a really good year following 2011. We saw really good reproduction, really good survival into the spring and early summer, and then things kind of unraveled in the summer because dry conditions returned and outflows were lower, and we went back to a low fall midwater trawl index. So I think flows needed in all years for particularly Delta smelt or the pelagic fish that rely on the Delta, and when they are depressed, and particularly for multiple years like we've seen, it's not a good situation, and it's a very difficult balancing question relative to meeting the needs of upstream species and in Delta species.
What you just talked about here with phytoplankton blooms reminds me of the hyacinth, and I've heard a lot about the impact on water operations, but what about from a fishery perspective, the hyacinth?
Well, hyacinth, was primarily, well, it was pretty much delta wide, but predominantly in the South Delta. It's, not being a bass fisherman, it was probably really, if you could get to open water, it was probably a pretty good bass fishing season. I don't know that hyacinth affects the pelagic fish that much because it's in the deeper South Delta in areas that they aren't normally. It's not so much in the Ship Channel or the main stem Sacramento, where particularly Delta smelt that seems to be their refugia, or depending on outflow into Sassoon Marsh as they rear. I'm sure it has an effect. It certainly had an effect on water operations and the ability to detect the effects of operations on Delta smelt in particular in the fall, in that the amount of debris reduces the sampling frequency and then changes the calculation of salvage and loss, which then affects subsequent operations because
The numbers.
the effect, the effect gets multiplied when you catch one fish. And that's something that we experienced this year.
How about on salmon and predation?
I'm not sure about the predation part, but what Carl just mentioned about affecting the sampling frequency, at least for the CVP, they've had to go from 30-minute counts every 2 hours to 10-minute counts, and like Carl was saying, that multiplies the error, multiplies the expansion to loss. That's one of the side effects to increased water hyacinth. Another is closing the bypasses. There's typically 4 bypasses for the CVP, and when water hyacinth is high, especially in that canal, they've had to close some of the bypasses, and that changes a lot of the sampling. When water hyacinth dies, then we have other issues, anoxic conditions. Like I said, when a fish is eaten, you can't tell. We are working with California Department of Parks and Rec and Division of Boating and Waterways, and also USDA on programmatic for water hyacinth, and also just in general aquatic invasive species, herbicide treatments, to make sure that herbicide treatment is effective, but not effective at killing fish. So that's a balancing act in itself.
Do you think when do you expect to have the programmatic approval?
We have individual consultations that have approved water hyacinth, Egeria densa sponge plant treatment. There's a misnomer that NIMS or Fish and Wildlife Service has limited, has required, but it's really what we analyzed in terms of what the action agency proposed. And we ended up concurring on the effects that are not likely to adversely affect the listed species and critical habitat. Individual treatments aren't very effective in terms of ESA. The action agencies come back to us every year. So we're working on and helping with the action agencies to start the process of a programmatic. We're talking about herbicides in general and not specific treatments of specific plant species, and looking at between 5 and 10 years. So we haven't started the documentation and actually analyzing the effects of it, but until then we do have provided the ESA coverage for the treatment of those species.
So it seems to me that these flexible approaches or creative approaches with the agencies and the stakeholders, that they'll only work if we have sufficient monitoring. And so you've outlined a number of challenges. Do you have the resources that you need in order to overcome those challenges? And, provide sufficient monitoring in order to determine if these alternate approaches are impacting fisheries such that you'd have to go into a contingency plan mode?
Are you referring to water hyacinth or in general?
In general, yeah.
So I think monitoring of the likes of the early warning monitoring surveys that took place in the winter and early spring of this year are extremely labor intensive and time intensive. And so the intent of those surveys is to be limited during times of drought. I think it would be challenging certainly on staff who have competing priorities to continue surveys at that intensity indefinitely, given our current capacity.
So I think, there are issues associated with increased monitoring in that it results in increased take. And so there are issues associated with that. There is an effort that came out of last year's drought funding that was provided by the legislature and the governor that supported additional work to come up with advanced monitoring techniques, particularly acoustic tags, pit tagging, and that kind of thing. We're currently working with the National Marine Fisheries Service Science Center in Santa Cruz to develop a pilot pit tag program that would facilitate our ability to track fish in real time. I think a point this year is that the winter run right? That were released to the river from the hatchery were acoustically tagged, at least a subset of them, and so that those could be monitored as they move down the river into the delta and inform decision making relative to operations there. So there's a lot underway. There is additional resources that were provided in the emergency authorization this spring to the department to add additional resources for in-delta sampling. And I think there are currently things in the governor's budget that would provide additional augmentations for monitoring and assessment work, similar to what was in last year's drought budget.
Yeah, this year was the third or fourth year of acoustically tagged winter run monitoring, but typically we don't get results back until the end of the year when they've all been processed. But this year we've asked for, and the Science Center has deployed 3 or 4 real-time monitoring stations so that any given fish that passes one of those stations will know immediately. They're not confirmed unless they pass 2 receivers, then we know that they're not in the belly of a predator. But we get reports on a daily basis at 6 a.m. With the understanding that they being the acoustically tagged winter run that we detect at real time are not going to dictate management decisions because it's a pilot, but it will certainly be used and considered as one of the tools. This year we've expanded it, and I think there's 2 tag groups, Feather River Spring Run, that have been acoustically tagged and tracked in the same way, and also I think Mill Creek. There's also an effort starting last year, particle PTM, particle tracking model. There's proponents and then there's people that don't like it. For our species, salmonids, they don't behave like neutrally buoyant particles. Our science center is working on the E part of it, the enhanced particle tracking, to put behaviors to particles and also mortality rates depending on location of these particles. So we're using that as a tool to reduce the take of listed species, and even if they're not listed.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I know we're running behind schedule, so I think we'll move. Hopefully, at least some of you can stay around because I'm sure we'll have questions as we have a lot of speakers to come. Next, for the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Science Program, Dr. Peter Goodwin.